In a staggering political spectacle, Donald Trump effectively transformed Gavin Newsom into arguably the most deeply humiliated state leader in the annals of American history. Standing on a live television broadcast, bathed in the glare of 40 different cameras, the California governor looked directly into the eyes of the President of the United States and delivered a specific sentence that would ultimately destroy his career. Tragically for Newsom, he was completely oblivious to the destructive nature of his words. He genuinely believed the phrase would be his ultimate salvation. This fundamental lack of self-awareness had always been Newsom's Achilles heel, his chronic inability to distinguish between a moment of triumphant victory and the exact second he was willingly handing his opponent a lethal weapon. Initially, the press briefing was scheduled to be a brief, 15-minute affair. It was supposed to feature a standard joint statement regarding federal infrastructure expenditures, complete with a backdrop of American flags and a press pool corralled in the rear, the precise type of mundane political theater that garners 11 seconds of evening news coverage before vanishing from the public's memory entirely. However, the governor of California harbored far more ambitious intentions. His staff had dedicated 2 exhaustive weeks to meticulously preparing him, scripting every conceivable answer and rehearsing every rhetorical pivot. For Newsom, this event had absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure. It was about generating viral video footage and laying down a formidable foundation for a potential 2028 presidential run. To truly comprehend how a famously charismatic governor, a man who had never previously lost command of a room while the cameras were rolling, managed to completely unravel in a mere 40 minutes, one must analyze his opening remarks and the immediate, devastating question the president posed in response. Newsom approached the lectern first, as was his customary practice. A subordinate handed him a smartphone, which he briefly inspected, nodded at, and then smoothly tucked away into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. Trump subsequently emerged entirely alone, unaccompanied by any aides or carrying any briefing folders. The president tapped the wooden podium twice with the flat of his hand, testing it the way a person might knock on a wall to determine if it is structurally hollow, before offering a vague, half-formed smile to the room at large. Without pausing to entertain any inquiries from the press, Newsom launched immediately into his prepared monologue. He commanded the room, aggressively asserting that California stands as the 4th largest economic powerhouse on the globe, financially eclipsing entire nations like Germany and India. He boldly proclaimed his state's absolute national dominance across multiple sectors, including technology and innovation, leading the country in digital advancement, green energy, pioneering renewable power initiatives, agriculture, and biotech, driving the future of farming and biological research, alongside a thriving film industry. Newsom passionately argued that California had constructed more, innovated further, and contributed a vastly greater share to America's future than any other state in the Republic. He stressed that they had achieved all of this, despite constantly battling a federal government that had spent the preceding year deploying military troops into urban centers and slashing vital social programs relied upon by everyday families. Then came the theatrical pause. Timing his delivery with absolute precision, Newsom turned to his left, locked eyes with the man standing a mere 4 feet away, and unleashed the exact insult his team had rigorously tested during 3 separate practice sessions. He stated that, with all due respect, California did not require management lectures from an individual who had managed to bankrupt casinos. The jab immediately resonated in the room. Several journalists seated in the front row quickly averted their eyes, intensely studying their notepads to mask their visible reactions, while a campaign staffer positioned behind the media risers gave 2 rapid nods of approval. The insult was sharp, it drew proverbial blood, and Newsom was keenly aware of his success. Indulging in his signature post-insult habit, the governor rocked back comfortably onto his heels, allowing the heavy silence of the room to amplify the sting of his words. If you have ever found yourself frustrated by a politician draped in a $5,000 tailored suit, delivering lectures on national fairness while his own jurisdiction crumbles around him, this was the defining moment. Instead of erupting in anger, the president simply offered a warm smile, preparing to ask a question that would completely derail the governor's meticulously planned afternoon. Trump completely ignored the personal insult. He did not physically bristle or show any signs of offense. Instead, he tapped the podium again, gazing at Newsom with the skeptical expression of a homeowner inspecting a wildly inaccurate construction estimate, and offered a slow, deliberate nod. "That was good," Trump conceded, complimenting the performance. "You practiced that one, Governor, or was that off the top?" Still heavily intoxicated by the apparent success of his casino remark, Newsom proudly declared that he was speaking purely from conviction. Trump seized upon the specific word, repeating conviction aloud as if physically examining it for its worth. He expressed his approval that they were speaking openly and from the heart today, noting that he had a few incredibly simple questions to ask, the exact type of elementary questions that even a guy known for bankrupting casinos could easily comprehend. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Trump offered a self-deprecating grin, utilizing his trademark ability to disarm an opponent by comfortably making light of his own historical business failure. However, beneath his relaxed posture and easygoing rhythm, a much deeper trap was being sprung. Newsom had just publicly confirmed on a live national broadcast that his statements were entirely unscripted, completely devoid of staff notes, and spoken purely from his own personal convictions. Consequently, the governor now fully owned every single syllable he would utter for the remainder of the event. Trump shifted his focus, noting that he had heard Newsom's claim that California didn't need any federal saving. He then asked a seemingly straightforward question: exactly how long had Newsom been in charge of the state, combining his time as both mayor and governor? Newsom proudly confirmed his tenure, stating he had served California in executive leadership roles for roughly 15 years. Trump acknowledged the lengthy timeline and delivered his first targeted inquiry. Asking the governor to speak purely from the heart, Trump demanded to know if the state's severe homelessness crisis was objectively better or worse now compared to when Newsom first took office. Newsom's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Recognizing the treacherous political terrain, he immediately retreated to his rehearsed talking points, describing homelessness as a deeply complex national emergency that demanded continuous federal partnership and vast investments in mental health care investments. He boldly claimed the current federal administration had systematically destroyed. Trump abruptly cut him off, reminding him that he was not asking about the entire nation, but specifically about the governor's own state and his own 15-year record. He pressed for a simple binary answer: better or worse. It was at this precise juncture that the cameras captured a subtle movement that most live viewers missed, but which would later be scrutinized frame by frame with the intensity of the Zapruder film. For a fleeting half-second, Newsom's eyes darted downward beneath the rim of the lectern to a concealed shelf where his smartphone was resting. He visually searched for a response, found his necessary data, and instantly his smooth demeanor and polished smile returned. Newsom confidently declared that California had invested more financial resources into combating homelessness than any other state in the history of the country, boasting of $27 billion in direct expenditures that yielded tangible results, such as a 9% decrease in the unsheltered population. Trump latched onto the massive figure, repeating $27 billion multiple times in disbelief. He humorously mused about what he could personally accomplish with such astronomical funding. Leaning into his business persona, he admitted that while he had made his fair share of notoriously bad deals, joking that his critics adore bringing up his casino and stake ventures, which elicited more laughter from the room, he needed clarification on the raw data. He demanded that the governor tell the nation exactly how many human beings were currently sleeping on the streets of California. When Newsom attempted to reiterate the 9% reduction metric, Trump sternly corrected him, demanding the actual hard number, not a deflected percentage. Forced into a corner, Newsom admitted that approximately 187,000 individuals experience homelessness on any given night in the state. Trump allowed the devastating statistic to hang heavily in the silent room, refusing to quickly move past the bad news. He solemnly addressed the governor, admitting once again to his own historical business failures, but forcefully declaring that he had never, in his entire life, spent $27 billion only to end up with a fundamentally larger problem than he had when he started. He sharply quipped that he couldn't intentionally construct a deal that disastrous, even if he actively tried to. Newsom desperately attempted to categorize the president's framing as a gross oversimplification of a multi-decade crisis, but Trump shut him down by pointing out that it was the governor's own personally cited number, spoken purely from his alleged conviction. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The laughter evaporated, replaced by the crushing reality of an abstract statistic, suddenly carrying the heavy burden of true accountability. Sensing the shifting tide, Newsom executed a masterful pivot, redirecting the conversation toward California's economic strengths and output. However, Trump swiftly interrupted his momentum, pointing out that California used to be the innovation capital of the world. Counting slowly on his fingers, Trump listed the massive corporate titans that had completely abandoned the state under Newsom's watch. Tesla, reminding the room that Elon Musk once loved the state before fleeing. Other tech giants, listing SpaceX, Oracle, Hewlett, Packard, HP. Corporate institutions, naming Chevron and Charles Schwab as high-profile departures. Trump bluntly stated that he didn't personally lure these massive corporations to Texas with greeting cards. Rather, they were actively running away from Newsom's leadership. He quoted Elon Musk's alleged preference for building advanced rockets in a muddy South Texas swamp over remaining in California, characterizing the state's economy not as a thriving marketplace, but as a catastrophic going-out-of-business sale. When questioned if everyday citizens were fleeing for tax reasons as well, Trump dropped another staggering metric. 1.7 million residents had fled the state since 2020. He contextualized the sheer volume of the exodus by comparing it to the entire metropolitan population of Phoenix, simply packing up their lives and vanishing. He noted they didn't move to foreign countries like France. They specifically relocated to alternative American states that functionally work. Once again, the governor's eyes darted beneath the podium to consult his hidden mobile device for a fleeting half-second. While casual viewers might have missed this repetitive physical tell, middle-class Americans watching from their living rooms in states like Ohio and Louisiana regions, Newsom had previously dismissed on a podcast as mere flyover territory began to notice. The viewers recognized the universal body language of a panicked middle manager frantically checking his phone during a corporate meeting because he lacked the answers to his superior's inquiries. Finding his scripted footing once more, Newsom beamed a polished smile and countered that people also immigrate to California, claiming consecutive years of population growth. Trump effortlessly dismissed this, clarifying that the growth was purely from foreign immigration, while actual American citizens were abandoning the state in droves, likening it to a landlord losing all his current tenants and desperately advertising to replace them. Newsom labeled the characterization as deeply misleading, yet noticeably failed to deny its factual accuracy. The reality was glaringly apparent. The governor had burned through $27 billion while homelessness expanded. The globe's largest corporations had abandoned his jurisdiction, 1.7 million citizens had relocated, and his only defense mechanism was to repeatedly glance at a concealed screen. Changing his tactical approach, the showman in Trump slightly retreated, replaced by a much quieter, more grounded tone. He openly confessed to his own imperfections, freely admitting to saying and doing foolish things in his past. He recounted a disastrous moment where he told an audience he was the most humble person in the room, pausing to admit that the remark didn't go great. This elicited genuine, warm laughter from the press corps, the type of communal laughter that arises when a leader invites the room to laugh alongside him rather than at someone else's expense. Transitioning into a deeply earnest delivery, Trump spoke directly to the everyday citizens watching from home. He argued that regular folks care absolutely nothing about political polish or perfectly styled hair. Glancing apologetically at the heavily stylized governor to a chorus of chuckles, Trump insisted that the American people care about one singular, defining metric, whether a leader actually follows through on their promises. He praised the working-class viewers for passing this fundamental test of integrity every single day, paying their mortgages, keeping their utilities on, showing up to exhausting jobs, and honoring their commitments to their families and neighbors in forgotten towns that Washington elites never visit. For a profound moment, Trump bypassed the journalists entirely, seemingly speaking straight across a kitchen table to the American public. He praised their untelevised dedication, noting they do the hard work without camera crews, fashion magazine covers, or politicians validating their worth. He tapped into their profound exhaustion, validating their deep frustration with constantly being lectured on societal morality by political figures who cannot manage to keep a single solitary promise. This populist appeal finally shattered Newsom's manufactured composure. Abandoning his smooth, teleprompter-ready delivery, the governor erupted with a raw, genuinely dangerous anger that completely bypassed anything his staff could have ever pre-written on a flashcard. This unpolished rage revealed the true, deeply combative nature of Gavin Newsom, a man far more lethal when genuinely furious than when cloaked in political artificiality. Turning his full physical attention to Trump and entirely ignoring the press pool, Newsom launched a blistering counteroffensive regarding broken promises. He aggressively rapid-fired accusations. He demanded to know if Mexico had ever paid for the border wall. He questioned the unreleased tax returns. He brought up the false promises that COVID would miraculously vanish by Easter. He lambasted the president's infamous comments about injecting bleach. Stepping aggressively closer to the microphone, Newsom branded Trump a convicted felon who had issued pardons to individuals who had assaulted law enforcement officers with American flags. He condemned the administration's border policies, accusing Trump of forcibly separating migrant children from their mothers and subsequently losing track of them completely. Incensed, Newsom demanded to know how a man with such a catastrophic record dared to stand in his state and lecture him about the concept of showing up. Lowering his voice to a threatening register, Newsom ceased delivering political talking points and began issuing direct legal ultimatums. He promised to relentlessly sue the president every time a law was broken and block every instance of federal overreach. He vowed that if Trump deployed even one more soldier into an American city against the citizens' will, he would physically stand on the courthouse steps the very next morning, backed by every single attorney in California. He clarified that this wasn't merely a campaign promise, but a guaranteed schedule of events. Pivoting back to the cameras, Newsom addressed the American people directly, framing Trump not as a president, but as an aspiring authoritarian king who responds to pushback by throwing infantile tantrums disguised in a suit and assigning juvenile nicknames before fleeing to his next political rally. The blistering attack undeniably landed. Even hardened, cynical journalists paused their note-taking, professionally impressed by the sheer force of the onslaught. For 30 glorious seconds, Gavin Newsom commanded total control of the room, presenting the absolute most effective, fierce version of his political persona. Had the broadcast terminated precisely at that moment, the aggressive soundbite would have dominated the evening news cycle under the banner "Newsom Fires Back," inevitably launching serious discussions about a 2028 presidential campaign. Unfortunately for the governor, the event pressed forward. Trump did not flinch, visually wither, or attempt to interrupt the tirade. He allowed Newsom to completely empty his clip, letting the heavy silence following the outburst stretch to the point of profound discomfort. When Trump finally responded, his vocal register had dropped lower and slower, causing the front-row reporters to physically lean forward in anticipation. Trump calmly and shockingly conceded that perhaps more than half of the governor's vicious accusations were entirely factually correct. He reiterated that he was never a saint, noting that his wife, his children, and the entire American populace were well aware of his glaring personal flaws. The unscripted, live television admission of fault stunned the room into absolute stillness. However, Trump swiftly weaponized this moment of humility to expose Newsom's aggressive evasion tactic. Counting on his fingers once again, Trump methodically dismantled the governor's rhetorical sleight of hand. He noted that when asked directly about California's exploding homeless crisis, Newsom deflected to January 6th. When asked about the massive corporate exodus, he pivoted to border controversies. And when confronted with 1.7 million fleeing citizens, Newsom simply delivered an angry speech about Trump's personal character. Dropping his hand, Trump posed a devastating inquiry. If California was truly thriving, as Newsom claimed, why was the governor physically incapable of discussing his own state's successes for 2 minutes without constantly invoking Trump's name? 3 direct questions about California had yielded 3 aggressive deflections about someone else. This critical juncture presented a terrifying precipice, and Newsom's off-camera staff silently prayed he would abandon the aggressive posturing and safely retreat back to the dull, scripted infrastructure talking points. But Newsom, addicted to the spotlight and blinded by his own perceived rhetorical brilliance, couldn't stop himself. The very hubris that propelled him to stardom was about to orchestrate his absolute downfall, hinging entirely on a single, catastrophic sentence. "You want to talk about loyalty, Mr. President? About trust?" Newsom challenged forcefully. He boldly declared that he had absolutely never betrayed the trust of his constituents. He cited his repeated electoral victories, surviving both standard elections and a contentious recall effort, claiming the people chose him because they knew he always showed up, never ran, never hid, and most importantly, never engaged in betrayal. The moment the word betray escaped his lips, a suffocating silence immediately blanketed the room. Half of the assembled crowd instantly knew the devastating historical landmine the governor had just stepped on, while the other half waited in breathless suspense. All of Trump's restless, performative tics completely vanished, falling away like a discarded garment. What remained was a terrifyingly still, emotionally flat adversary. Speaking with a quiet, lethal precision, Trump slowly repeated the governor's exact phrasing, framing the word never with the delicate care of handling fragile glass. Despite feeling the immense danger of the moment, Newsom stubbornly doubled down, refusing to retreat from his absolute statement. Trump offered a slow nod before dropping two incredibly destructive words. Alex Turk. Following a heavy pause, Trump identified Turk as Newsom's former campaign manager and proclaimed best friend, asking the governor exactly how many years their friendship had spanned. Visibly tightening, Newsom attempted to dismiss the inquiry as being beneath the dignity of the office, coldly referring to Turk as merely a valued colleague whose matters had already been addressed. Trump ruthlessly bulldozed the weak defense, forcefully reminding the room that Turk was undeniably Newsom's closest friend of a decade. He recounted how Turk had dedicated his life to running the governor's campaigns and building the very Homeless Connect initiative that originally launched Newsom's political career. Trump painted a picture of profound, battle-tested trust, forged over 10 years of political warfare. "And you slept with his wife," Trump stated bluntly. The subsequent silence was physically oppressive, characterized only by the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system. Trump seamlessly transitioned this horrific personal betrayal into a masterclass on political hypocrisy. He reminded the audience that Newsom constantly preached about accountability. When the scandalous affair was originally exposed, Newsom had stood before similar television cameras, tearfully promising the public that he was taking the matter seriously and formally entering rehabilitation. Tilting his head inquisitively, Trump demanded to know if the governor actually ever went to rehab. Newsom weakly protested that the issue was deeply personal and had been publicly addressed. But Trump struck the final, fatal blow. He quoted an interview Newsom gave to the Sacramento Bee 11 years later, wherein the governor admitted there was absolutely no rehab, no official treatment, and no intervention. He had simply stopped drinking on his own. Shaking his head not in anger, but in sheer bewilderment, Trump pointed out the governor's fundamental pathology. He had lied to the entire country about seeking medical help, simply because it was what the room desperately needed to hear at the time, fully intending to do whatever he pleased behind closed doors. "You have been doing it the whole time we have been standing here," Trump declared, delivering the sentence that mentally forced every person in the room to instantly replay the preceding 30 minutes of the press conference. The pattern was suddenly, horrifyingly illuminated for everyone watching. On the homelessness question, Newsom had glanced down at his concealed phone before smoothly redirecting to a national crisis. On the state exodus question, his eyes dropped again before launching an attack on Trump's legal record. On the question of personal betrayal, the downward glance preceded a grand, manufactured speech about the solemn dignity of the gubernatorial office. It was the exact same deceptive maneuver executed flawlessly 3 consecutive times. The subtle look down, the polished recovery, the rebooted smile. The American public didn't need a political pundit to explain the dynamic. They had witnessed the fraudulent pattern unfold live, confirming every lingering suspicion they ever held about slick political operators. Trump didn't bother listing the individual examples because he didn't have to. The audience had already connected the dots, resulting in a chilling wave of recognition washing over the room. Trump successfully articulated what everyone had intuitively felt, but lacked the vocabulary to express. Newsom had spent 15 years in Sacramento utilizing the exact same evasive, phone-checking maneuvers and was now audaciously attempting to bring that fraudulent routine to the White House. Standing at the podium, Newsom remained dead quiet for an extended duration. When he finally broke the silence, the artificial polish had completely evaporated. His tone was raspy, significantly lower, and genuinely raw, a beautiful, fleeting glimpse of authentic humanity breaking through a lifetime of heavily rehearsed artificiality. His voice catching emotionally on the word fine, Newsom aggressively dared Trump to break him down to his absolute lowest point, but fiercely swore he would not allow his entire life struggle to be stolen. He launched into a deeply personal account of his severe childhood dyslexia, revealing he was entirely unable to read a standard paragraph until the age of 12. He recounted the humiliation of teachers branding him as stupid on official academic evaluations that his mother was forced to sign. He detailed his parents' painful divorce and the relentless, daily fight he had waged for his entire existence just to remain standing in rooms filled with people eager to see him fail. He passionately declared he had been fighting since long before the president even knew his name. The sheer emotional vulnerability of the monologue captivated the room. It was so profoundly authentic that a hardened reporter in the second row respectfully looked down at her hands, and even Trump sat in total, uninterrupted silence, affording the governor the basic human dignity the raw moment demanded. Newsom had laid all his childhood trauma, disabilities, and personal pain bare on the table. Yet Trump did not blink. He patiently allowed the heavy silence to linger, letting Newsom's profound words hang in the atmosphere like the lingering smoke of extinguished incense. When Trump finally responded, his voice was utterly devoid of its usual bombastic showmanship, replaced by a rare, solemn tone that bordered closely on genuine respect. He looked directly at Newsom, deliberately ignoring the bank of television cameras, and sincerely told the governor that he completely believed him. He validated the governor's struggle, acknowledging the undeniable reality and profound difficulty of a severely dyslexic child fighting his way to the pinnacle of American political power. Trump emphasized that nobody in the room was denying the authenticity of that personal battle. However, Trump then executed the most devastating rhetorical pivot of the afternoon. He noted that the 40 million citizens of California had spent 15 years trying to decipher Newsom's true character, and they had just been given the ultimate answer. Trump commended the governor for delivering an incredibly passionate, heartfelt speech regarding his dyslexia, his fractured family, and his lifelong struggles. "But Governor," Trump stated softly, pointing out the fatal flaw in the impassioned monologue, "in that whole speech, you did not mention them once." The room fell deathly silent as Trump listed the forgotten casualties of Newsom's administration. He highlighted that during his passionate defense, the governor completely failed to mention the 187,000 human beings suffering on the sidewalks, the desperate families incapable of paying rent, the devastated restaurant owners forced into permanent bankruptcy, while Newsom infamously dined at the luxurious French Laundry with political lobbyists, or the 1.5 million residents who were economically forced to pack their belongings and flee the state entirely. After a brief pause, Trump delivered the ultimate verdict. He noted that Newsom had just spent 30 seconds fighting desperately for his own political survival on stage, yet every single word out of his mouth was entirely about himself. Maintaining a steady, unyielding gaze, Trump delivered the killing blow. "You have been fighting your whole life, Governor, just never for them." Those 11 words did not merely punctuate the end of a sentence. They descended upon the heavily air-conditioned press conference with the crushing, inescapable, and absolute gravity of a jury's final guilty verdict echoing through a breathless courtroom. It was a sentence that completely fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure of the room. Absolutely nobody laughed. Nobody physically shifted their weight. Nobody rustled a notepad, and nobody reached for a camera shutter. The entire room, packed with seasoned political journalists and hardened campaign operatives, was instantly frozen in a state of suspended animation, trapped in an agonizingly long period of collective shock. The president's statement wasn't a rehearsed comedic jab, nor was it a standard, focus-grouped political insult designed for cable news outrage. It was something far more lethal. It was a profound, unvarnished, and devastatingly precise truth that completely bypassed the brain's standard cognitive processing centers and struck directly at the core of human recognition. It was a devastating observation that, once spoken aloud into the universe, could never possibly be retracted, walked back, or spun by a press secretary. It hung in the space between the two men, an undeniable reality that sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Standing entirely paralyzed behind the heavy wooden lectern, Gavin Newsom looked as though the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to ash. Operating purely on a subconscious, desperate muscle memory, the governor's meticulously manicured hand instinctively drifted downward, slipping below the wooden rim toward the hidden, recessed shelf housing his smartphone. The sleek device had been vibrating softly but relentlessly against the wood for 40 continuous minutes. It was being desperately fed by a war room of terrified staffers who were frantically attempting to supply him with a continuous stream of fresh talking points, clever counter-arguments, and heavily focus-grouped lines of attack. This piece of black glass and silicon was the very same digital lifeline that had successfully rescued him 3 times prior during this exact press conference. It was the ultimate digital weapon he had utilized for months on end to mock Trump's intelligence, orchestrate viral takedowns, and propagate carefully curated memes in his relentless, unyielding quest for the ultimate national political spotlight. As the phone buzzed one final, desperate time, a harsh, mechanical vibration against the silence, Newsom finally tore his eyes away from the crowd and looked down at the illuminated screen. He was searching for salvation, but there was absolutely nothing displayed in that glowing rectangle that could possibly salvage his permanently shattered career. The incoming text messages were a blur of panicked capital letters and useless strategic advice. No meticulously crafted, multi-million-dollar talking point could undo the devastating psychological damage of those 11 words. No incredibly clever rhetorical pivot could successfully redirect the audience's attention away from the raw, undeniable truth that had just been exposed. And no witty, trending hashtag could ever magically transform this apocalyptic, career-ending disaster into a favorable, easily digestible social media clip. The digital armor had failed completely. In an act of total, undeniable surrender, Newsom slowly reached out and turned the smartphone completely face down onto the wooden shelf. He didn't lock the screen, he just smothered it. The faint, barely audible click of the smooth glass screen making physical contact with the hard wood became, in that terrifying moment, the absolute loudest sound in the utterly silent room. It was an incredibly intimate acoustic detail, captured flawlessly by every single highly sensitive, active microphone clustered on the podium. The profound irony of the moment was completely inescapable. The modern politician who had spent long, grueling months aggressively cultivating an entire political identity through a digital screen was now forcefully compelled to place that screen face down before the entire viewing nation, utterly bereft of any remaining answers, defenses, or excuses. When a veteran political reporter seated near the center of the front row gently, almost apologetically, cleared her throat and meekly asked the governor if he had any official response, the spell was temporarily broken. Yet, Newsom simply stared blankly into the empty, artificial void existing in the space between the hostile, blinking red lights of the broadcast cameras and the victorious political opponent standing just 4 feet to his right. His jaw was locked. His eyes were hollow. He offered absolutely no reply. The silence was his only remaining statement. Before the panicked network pool directors in control rooms across the country even had a chance to scramble and mercifully cut their live broadcast feeds to commercial breaks, the devastating 15-second clip of Trump's 11 words and Newsom's agonizing, silent surrender was already circulating wildly across the global internet. The digital contagion was instantaneous and entirely unstoppable. Within the hour, sensing the massive seismic shift in the political landscape, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis posted a brutally succinct 5-word reaction online. He just described the whole party. Absolutely no further elaboration or context was required. DeSantis, alongside every single independent citizen reading the viral post, instantly recognized that Trump hadn't merely destroyed a single, ambitious man standing at a podium. Instead, the former president had accurately and surgically vivisected an entire species of self-serving, performative political animals. This resonant, universal truth, the sudden exposure of the political class's inherent selfishness, propelled the viral video clip across every corner of the internet vastly faster and with infinitely more devastating impact than any expensive, heavily produced campaign advertisement could have ever historically achieved. Far from the bright lights of the stage, out in the venue's dimly lit, echoing marble hallway, the collateral damage was already beginning to manifest. A prominent, deeply influential Democratic congressman, a man who had fiercely, publicly defended Newsom through 2 grueling, impossibly expensive election cycles and a remarkably vicious, high-stakes recall attempt, leaned his entire body weight heavily against a cold marble wall. He looked physically exhausted, refusing to make even fleeting eye contact with a probing, eager reporter who had cornered him for a quote. With a voice thick with resignation, the congressman sorrowfully admitted that Newsom's true, fatal problem wasn't merely the act of getting caught in a rhetorical trap on live television. The far deeper, more systemic tragedy was the unspoken reality that the entire political party apparatus had always known the fundamental truth about his character. The congressman quietly confessed that they had all dutifully, blindly covered for the governor's glaring narcissistic flaws for years, bound tightly by the strict rules of blind partisan loyalty and political survival. But, he acknowledged with a heavy sigh, you can no longer successfully protect a manufactured political commodity once the general public entirely and irreversibly stops believing in the illusion. With that grim, career-defining admission hanging in the corridor, the congressman violently pushed his weight off the marble wall and hurried rapidly away toward the exit, disappearing before the stunned journalist's audio recording device could even be fully raised. Later that evening, as the political shockwaves continued to violently ripple across the nation, the fallout reached the prime-time broadcasts. During a typically combative cable news panel discussion, a fiercely loyal political commentator desperately attempted to mount a pathetic, last-ditch defense of the governor, stubbornly citing Newsom's demonstrable record of financial investment into state infrastructure. The veteran news anchor, clearly exhausted by the relentless spin and recognizing the shifting historical tide, didn't even bother looking up from her illuminated tablet. She coldly interrupted the commentator's rehearsed monologue to ask one simple question. If the state's economic and social record was truly as spectacular as claimed, why were 1.7 million desperate citizens actively fleeing the jurisdiction? The stunned commentator simply opened and closed her mouth in total silence, resembling a fish pulled suddenly from the water. Bereft of a pre-written counter-argument to a suddenly universally accepted truth, she offered nothing. Recognizing the total intellectual defeat, the anchor mercifully prompted the control room to awkwardly move the panel on to the next segment. Back at the original venue, the architect of this political destruction was making his exit. Trump confidently stepped out of the heavily secured building and walked directly into the blinding, warm California sunshine. Remarkably, he didn't bother issuing a gloating, triumphant press release to the gathered media, nor did he attempt to take a boastful victory lap for the cameras. He simply paused at the heavy glass exit doors, adjusting his suit jacket. Turning slightly, he cast one final, sweeping glance back through the tinted glass toward the press room, where the vanquished governor still remained frozen in shock at the wooden podium. Speaking incredibly quietly, almost entirely to himself rather than his entourage, Trump muttered to a nearby Secret Service aide, "Beautiful state. Shame." That singular, incredibly heavy word hung thickly in the dry afternoon air for a fleeting second. Then, the heavy, armored door of his black SUV slammed definitively shut. The massive motorcade aggressively pulled out of the loading bay, its sirens briefly wailing, and the tracking cameras silently watched the caravan of vehicles vanish around the corner, leaving the wreckage entirely behind. Inside the silent hall, Gavin Newsom remained entirely paralyzed at the podium for a full 40 seconds after the final broadcast camera's red light had officially blinked off and the feed was dead. The silence had morphed from shocking to deeply uncomfortable. Eventually, a timid, terrified junior staff member tentatively approached the stage and gently touched the governor's tailored arm, physically breaking the hypnotic, paralyzing trance. Moving with agonizing slowness, the governor slowly picked up his silenced smartphone. He held the black rectangle limply in his palm for a long moment, completely lacking the courage to ever turn the glass screen back over to face him. Without a single word, he slid the useless device deep into his suit jacket pocket and began mechanically walking off the stage. He didn't acknowledge the dead, staring lenses of the camera equipment. He actively refused to make eye contact with a single soul, not his staff, not the remaining journalists, not the security personnel on his long, lonely walk toward the exit. He moved with the hollow, heavily devastated gait of a man who had suddenly, violently realized a terrifying truth. The magnificent, impregnable political fortress he had spent his entire adult life meticulously constructing actually possessed a glaringly wide-open door he had simply never noticed. And, to his absolute horror, absolutely everyone in the entire world had been peering directly through it the entire time except for him.